Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Wilton Library for the first session of what's going to be another amazing series with our friend Gil Harel. Uh, we're always thinking, Gil and I, of things that we can put together that really kind of rise above the sort of regular programming and kind of reach up. This is, I would say, probably getting towards like a graduate seminar in music history. So we got a great professor to help us through it. I'm Michael Bellicosa. I'm the head of adult programming here at the library, so I get to put all these programs together. I'm also the curator of the Brubeck collection, which is one of the most significant jazz archives in the world, and largely because of Dave and his family's relationship to Wilton, where he spent almost his whole adult life, their relationship with us at the library. We have the Brubeck collection here at Wilton Library. Um, I suggest you come for a visit. The only kind of comparable jazz archives in the world are things like Duke Ellington materials at the Smithsonian, Ella Fitzgerald materials at Library of Congress. Louis Armstrong has a whole house and museum, and then there's us. So there's no public library anywhere that's got anything like it. Got thousands of photographs, thousands of tracks of unreleased recordings that Dave had made of concerts and other appearances, all kinds of memorabilia, lots of handwritten music, everything. It's amazing. We also, about a year ago, launched a digital archive for the collection. You can go to that. It's easy to remember, brubeckcollection.org, or there's a button on the library's website right on the top. And you can go in there and you can search and browse and uh, look at photographs, listen to snippets of recordings, uh, to your heart's content. Right now, there's information on over 22,000 items accessible through that website and a little over 1,200 digitized items that you can look at or listen to. So feel free to take a look at that. And our latest development, starting really just a couple days ago, we have launched social media channels for the Brubeck collection as distinct from the social media channels of the library. So uh, if you know how QR codes work, take a picture. Otherwise, go to the site, go to our website, and go land on our Facebook and land on our Instagram and like us and follow us and share all our stuff. We're going to be posting multiple times per week, all kinds of interesting stuff. We already started this week. So that's kind of the big news. The next big news is that we have a jazz concert coming up on Sunday, April 27. It is not officially announced, so you can't register yet, but that will happen in about a week or so. So keep your eyes on the e-newsletter and for the e-blast that will come out, like I said, in about a week or so. Ali Ryerson, great flute player, coming with a quartet. She was here 10 years ago. Going to be a really great concert on Sunday afternoon. And then two more concerts that we're still working out the details, but you can do a save the date in your calendars if you want to. And that's going to be the evening of Saturday, May 10, and also the evening of Saturday, June 14. Going to be a couple of really interesting, wonderful concerts. And those will be announced probably in a month and a half. But the one coming up in April, just keep your eyes out for the announcement. It should be in about a week. Okay, usual protocols. So please take your cell phones off. We're making a recording of this so that people can watch it on our YouTube channel. And keeping the cell phones off will hopefully make the recording a little bit better. And I've talked to you about that. The 5-part series, you've undoubtedly all read about it. It's going to be an amazing tour through the history of musical settings of the Mass. I don't want to steal a line from Gil because maybe he's going to say the same thing, but we were talking about this when we were coming up with this idea. And for most really important composers, doing a musical setting of the Mass is kind of like the equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. And the great ones really left some big, big masterpieces, which we're going to see parts of. And leading up to our own Dave Brubeck, who said a whole Roman Catholic Mass, a piece called To Hope, a Celebration. And the 5th session is going to be all about that. I know a lot of you know Gil, but I'm going to read a little bit about his bio and then turn it over to him. So he's got a PhD from Brandeis University, and he's a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz. Previously, he served on the faculty at CUNY Baruch College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellence Award for Distinguished Teaching. Currently, he's a full professor of music at Connecticut State, Naugatuck Valley, where he has been presented with the AFT Merit Award for exemplary service to the college for 6 consecutive years. In 2020, he was honored with the coveted Connecticut Board of Regents Teaching Award. At NVCC, Dr. Harel conducts the college chorale a cappella ensemble, teaches music history and theory, serves as a musical director of theater productions. We've been doing a lot of work with him over these years, and we hope to do it for many more years. He's great. And let me turn it over now to my friend Gil.
And what better way to kick off this series than with a foray into the realm of medieval music? I would suggest that there are probably only a handful of folks in the room, although maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps I am. Correct me if I am later after the program. You can let me know that I have erred. But I would suggest that, generally speaking, it is a very small cross section of the general population, even the music-loving general population, that is familiar with or enamored with medieval music. After tonight, that cross-section is going to grow just a little bit, I hope. Tonight's program will be a split one where we'll spend the first half talking about medieval music, and then we will segue into the Renaissance, and I'll talk about how settings of the Mass changed from the earliest incarnations in the 14th century to later masterpieces by composers including Josquin des Prez and, for example, Giovanni Luigi da Palestrina. Of course, when we're talking about the Mass, I just want to begin by saying kudos to our very own Michael Bellicosa for facilitating and greenlighting this series, because we're really connecting dots that on the surface may seem quite disparate. In the title of this series, we have From the Middle Ages to Dave Brubeck. Perhaps you might surmise that those eras, let's say the Middle Ages versus the modern era, the 20th century, the 21st century even, are not ones that have a salient musical connection. But we will see, my friends, beginning today, we will see that there is a long history associated with the setting of this particular liturgical text, and that it does indeed connect Dave Brubeck back with more than half a millennium of composers who were treating this particular text and setting it to music. So without further ado, let's talk about the text. What does it mean when we talk about a mass setting or a musical mass? Some of you who are inveterate concert goers have probably heard the Mass sung any number of times. Let's see some hands. How many of us have heard the Mass performed? How many of us have participated in a choral concert on the risers and sung the Mass? Well, sure, if you've ever been in a community chorus, odds are that you've sung a Mass every few concerts or so, right? And it doesn't matter who the composer is. There are any number of wonderful Mass settings. Some composers set this text over and over and over again. For example, Franz Joseph Haydn set the Mass nearly 24 times. Mozart also said it more than a dozen times. The most famous setting is one we'll talk about down the road in this series, the C minor Mass, which was composed probably as a kind of a vehicle for showcasing his new wife, Constanze Mozart, and her abilities as a soprano soloist. But even someone like J.S. Bach set the Mass to music, which would raise a few eyebrows today if you know about Bach's pietist Lutheran background. After all, the Mass text, the setting of what is called in Latin the Missa Tota, the complete Mass, something that is traditionally associated with the Catholic Church. I'm going to talk about why that is. But by the 1740s, even Johann Sebastian Bach, pietist Lutheran, I once asked my dissertation advisor many years ago, I said, Professor, I keep encountering this term in the literature, pietist Lutheranism, which is associated with Saxony, sort of central Germany in the Baroque period. What does that refer to? And he looked at me and he said, oh, the pietists. Those are the no fun Lutherans. What does it tell us? What does it mean? Well, if Bach himself was setting a mass in its complete array of texts, it means that the setting of the Mass by the late Baroque period had become something which, as Michael alluded to, was not just something that a Catholic composer would do, but really it was considered a rite of passage that any composer worth his or her salt would eventually tackle this particular bout of text and set it to music, whether that was for performance in a traditional Eucharistic service or not. That's going to change. Obviously, as we get closer to our own period, we're going to see more settings of the Mass that are perhaps conceived of as concert pieces. That will be the case, for example, with Leonard Bernstein and with Arvo Pärt, and certainly with Dave Brubeck. That doesn't mean you can't perform these Mass settings as part of a Eucharistic service, but it does mean that the piece as a genre evolves quite a bit, which of course we would expect. If we're talking about a genre of choral music that goes back, by golly, nearly 700 years, it stands to reason that it will have evolved quite a bit. One of the things we'll want to do during this lecture series over the next few months is to appreciate both how the genre evolves, but also how it stays grounded in some foundational attributes that make it unambiguously connected on this continuum. So let's talk about the text. When we talk about a Mass in music, we are talking about the setting of a liturgical text which is associated with the Eucharistic rites. What does that mean? Well, remember, as we are now approaching the climax of Lenten Tide, and we will soon be in Easter. Easter will fall between our second and third programs, I believe. We have to think about what it meant hundreds of years ago, or even today, to celebrate the Mass. Celebrating the Mass, and we could talk all night about this, so I will try to keep this particular part of the program succinct. When the priest, traditionally it was the priest, raises the host and says the Latin words, hoc est corpus meum, from, for example, Matthew 26, the priest is invoking the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, when Jesus says to the disciples, at the Last Supper, take, eat. This is my body. Hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. Do this for the remembrance of me and for our new covenant. As Christianity developed, one of the most important sacraments, that's an important word, we will encounter that word throughout this series, was the celebration of this rite. Corpus meum, sangre meum, the body and the blood. And in traditional Catholicism, once the priest utters those words, something really remarkable, miraculous happens. Because that wafer, the bread that the priest is blessing, is no longer bread. It's no longer a wafer. Through a process called transubstantiation, that wafer becomes the body of Christ. The Lutherans will have a different take on it. Martin Luther would argue that it's not transubstantiation, but rather consubstantiation. We'll talk about that in our next program when we talk about Bach. There would be important texts associated with the canonical hours. So in this case, we're talking about the Mass Ordinary text. Why do we call it the Mass Ordinary? Well, because this would be the text that would be celebrated, chanted in the Middle Ages, for example, for any ordinary Sunday, for any ordinary day when you are taking communion. And so therefore, we call it the Mass Ordinary. This is the text that you have for any date on the liturgical calendar which is not a proper day, a special day. And they use the term Mass proper to distinguish. Mass proper would be, for example, a text that is more suited to a particular feast day on the calendar or a particular holiday, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost. But if you're on the 26th Sunday in Trinity season, then you're going to just have the regular ordinary text. And what is that ordinary text? Well, it's the text that if you're a singer, you've sung it any number of times. And if you're an audience member who's attended choral concerts, you've probably heard it many times. There are 5 texts. Let's go over them. Number 1, Kyrie, coming from the Greek, not the Latin, but rather the Greek. Kyrie eleison actually comes from the Hebrew Chaneni Adonai. You can hear this, you can read this text or hear it in any number of Psalms. For example, Psalm 6, which I have set to music for SATB Divisi choir and piano. Psalm 6 has this text. It means, have mercy on me, Lord. So when we sing or hear the words Kyrie eleison, that's what the singers are intoning. Have mercy on me, Lord. Christe eleison, which comes right after the Kyrie, which means Christ have mercy. Let's remember what Christ means here. I often ask my students this question, and sometimes you get answers like, well, that was Jesus' last name. Let's remember that last names, as we understand patrilineal nomenclature, naming someone with the last name that is derived from the father, would be something that comes along many, many centuries after the time of Jesus. No. Christ comes from the word meaning anointed one. Heiland in German. I mentioned the German because Bach would set, for example, cantatas like number 61. Nun komm der Heiden Heiland. Now come Savior of the Gentiles. So when we hear this text, Christe eleison, yes, it does refer to Jesus, but it really means Messiah, Redeemer, have mercy. Then we go to the second movement, which has a very different quality. If the first movement is Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison in Greek, now in the second movement we go to Latin. And the Latin text here, one that we all know from the Christmas carols, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Glory to God in the highest. Et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis. And peace on earth and goodwill towards man or mankind. That's the second movement. The third movement has by far the most text. And if someone here can recite it all from memory, well, you should thank whoever put you in CCD class all those years ago. Because not a lot of people can recite the entirety of the third movement, which is the Credo. The Credo comes from a text that was conceived in the 4th century, way back in the year 325 at the Council of Nicaea. Trent is going to be 1545 to 1563. We're going to get to that one later. Council of Trent is counter-reformational, so that's much later. But the Council of Nicaea, this is a long text. And so therefore, in most mass settings, it will be the longest movement, although not always. Sometimes it is ponderously long. For example, in Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, which was composed towards the end of the composer's life, we get a credo which is 20 minutes long. And please pray for any soprano who has to sing that movement, because the soprano part is unforgiving, to say the least. Then we get the fourth movement, also derived from the Hebrew. The original Hebrew is Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tsevaot Melech Kol Haaretz. In Latin, Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus Deus Sabaoth. Holy, 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 Lord of hosts. And then that finally brings us to the fifth movement. Some of you know where we're going here. It is the fifth movement, not always the closing text, but it is almost certainly part of the closing text. And this one is translated as Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world. In Latin, Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi. If you know these texts, again, make sure to thank whoever it was who signed you up for CCD classes or put you in whatever after-school program where you learned it. If you're a choral singer, you will inevitably have more facility with the music if you are familiar with the text. And I often find that the choral singers that I work with, who have tremendous facility with this text, I'll say, I noticed you're off book very early. How do you know this text so well? And they'll say, oh, my parents made me sing in church. And I always say, go home and thank them. All right. We're going to begin our first Mass example back in the mid to late 14th century. Medieval music evolved comparatively slowly versus music in later eras. And so it's going to take a while for composers to understand what will eventually become familiar to a modern listener, for example, as the SATB division of the choir. When I say SATB, I mean soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And composers from Machaut, who we'll begin with momentarily, to Brubeck are going to be working with this, what would become the conventional division of the voices. We shouldn't take it for granted that this is the way that the chorus is configured. Because if we look at medieval music in preceding eras, for example, the works of Hildegard von Bingen, von just means of, Hildegard of Bingen, who lived, around the early 12th century into the mid 12th century, or of Léonin, Periton, composers who were working in the area of Paris, about a century after Hildegard, so around the year 1200, 1210, 1215. What we'll find is that their music eschews the traditional what we would think of as the traditional SATB division of chorus. It's when we get to the works of Guillaume de Machaut that we see this division coming up regularly. So we're skipping a lot of the Middle Ages and we're jumping into the late Middle Ages, and we're talking about something called the Ars Nova, the new art. Well, it's not new to us, but back then this was a wholly new style of writing. In this style, a few things are important to note. One, we have what we can officially start to think of. Machaut probably didn't think of it this way, but we can start to think of it as a bass line. And that bass line is going to dictate harmony. I can't overstate how important this is going to be for music, really in the centuries leading up until our own time. That the bass line in some way is going to be of paramount importance in dictating harmony. What we shouldn't do is fall into the trap of thinking of this music as being in a key or having chords that are familiar to us. Let me give you an example. You know I love my scores. Here is the Agnus Dei, the fifth and final movement of Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame, the Mass of Our Lady. Of course, Notre Dame, that is the dedication. It really has nothing to do with the actual text. One will find in not only in music history, but in architecture and in any number of artistic mediums, that various works are dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Let's remind ourselves that that's something that is more, this Mariological demonstration is more Catholic in nature. The word Catholic comes from a word meaning universal. And remember that up until 1517, Catholicism was the dominant, really the only, we wouldn't even say denomination, that's anachronistic. It was the form of Christianity that was practiced. Yes, some of you will say, but Gil, professor, what about the Cathars? What about the Waldensians? What about these sort of heretical groups, as they were considered heretical in those eras, that, let's say the 14th century for the Waldensians? Yes, these were fringe groups, and they may fascinate us today, but the truth is back then nobody knew about them. Very few people would have even heard of these heretical offshoots. For Catholics, the Virgin Mary has paramount importance. That's less true for Lutherans, for example. Luther would take a dim view of Mariological celebration, which he viewed as a form of idol worship. After all, Jesus is divine. The Holy Spirit is divine, Heilige Geist for Luther, and God is, of course, divine. But Mary is not really divine in that same way, and therefore, exaltation of the Virgin Mary in song and in other artistic mediums has the patina of idolatry. And therefore, we won't see it in Bach, but we will see it in a work like the Mass of Our Lady. It sounds better in French, doesn't it? If you were to say it in German, that would be the Messe unserer Frau. Unsere Frau. Yeah, I think we'd have to use the dative case, the Mass of Our Lady. Anyway, now that would be genitive case if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, the point is, we're looking at music in the Ars Nova here. And if you take a look at some of the hallmarks of the Ars Nova, yes, we have the countertenor, but look where it's transcribed for modern notation in the bass clef. You'll notice that the designations that Machaut used were different: tenor, motetus, triplum. If we look at the top line, we can get a sense for how unusually rhythmically syncopated this music is. And I'll count. Here's our beat. That's an anachronism too. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3. Ah, 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 nus, te, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1. Do 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 2, 3. Li pe ka yada da pa bim bam bam 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 di 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 mundi nobis. You see how unusually syncopated it is? If we're counting 1, 2, 3, and 1, bam, beat up, bam, 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 bam. The musicians in the room will especially be sensitive to how unusually syncopated this music is. What we don't want to do is look and say, well, look at that. We've got an F doubled and a C and an F. A jazz musician might call that an F chord with no third, an F5 chord, if you will. And then we continue reading and we say, oh, look at this. Okay, so I'm going to keep reading. And look, I've got F in the tenor, the contratenor is on C, A, say, oh, that's an F major chord. We have to shy away from this language. Machaut would not have thought of it as an F major chord. He would not have known what that was. He went back in a time machine and said, boy, Machaut, let me tell you something, brother. That cadence, the second phrase in the Agnus Dei, the F major chord, chef's kiss. He would have looked at you and said, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. The cadences get even stranger as we go on, and we have to appreciate just how funky this harmony is. This chord, for example, with F, C, F, that's kind of where the piece sits. But sometimes we get harmonies that are far flung, well away from there. D, A, D, A, so that's sort of an open fifth. They didn't really use triads all that often. You were more likely to find root fifth structures. On top of that, they did something that no music theory student would ever do today, which is they often wrote these notes in parallel so that you'd have parallel fifths moving from one fifth to the next. The musicians who have ever studied music theory will think, oh no, that's not allowed. And it's not. In fact, many a student has lost points there. If we look at the cadence on Mundi, sins of the world, peccata mundi are the sins of the world. You can see here a B here with a voice cross, D, F sharp. Well, B, D, and F sharp makes a chord, B minor. Today, if we were to juxtapose these harmonies to say, okay, here's B minor, here's where we're starting on F with a fifth, and here's the cadence to B minor, that sort of functional harmonic relationship later on would be totally avoided. It's bizarre to a later ear. What I would say about Machaut is when he's writing this in 1365 or so, there is no music theory textbook. It's the Wild West, folks, and anything goes. You want wild Hocket rhythms? Great. You want some sort of unusual imitative nature in the notes where they're following each other in very specific rhythmic configurations? We will find that in the works of Josquin later on. But for Machaut writing here, this is generally considered to be one of the first pieces in this genre. And therefore, if we're expecting it to sound familiar to us, accessible, like something you would have heard as the background music in a TV show that's set in a bygone era, no, no, no. For those of you who love Game of Thrones, if you're expecting to, Game of Thrones is set in a kind of analog of the Middle Ages in Europe, there's nothing in that show in the music. It was composed by Raman Djawadi, very great score, but there's nothing there that sounds authentically medieval. And the reason is, as we're about to see, I think for most people, medieval music, some of it at least, perhaps much of it, would sound, and I'm editorializing here, but it might sound utterly bizarre. Real medieval music would sound very strange to modern ears. Why? Well, again, there is no conception of harmony that would match the harmonic language of a composer even 200 years after Machaut. Without further ado, the best way to understand it is to listen to it. So let's listen to some of the music from Guillaume de Machaut's Messe de Notre Dame. Machaut, by the way, was a choir director, music director at a cathedral in Reims. And we know very little about these folks compared to Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, Brubeck. We know very little about someone who lived in the 14th century. We know that Machaut was prolific. He wrote secular music, love songs, and things of that nature. But liturgical music was also a big part of his output. And it stands to reason that as a musician of the 14th century, one of the best jobs you could get is a position that would later be called in German Kapellmeister, the master of music at a church. Because what that meant was a few things. Number one, you were going to have very capable singers. Especially at a cathedral church, you were going to have some of the best singers in the region. But it also meant that you were going to have the resources available to have help transcribing the music and preserving the music. So were there any number of composers writing part songs, let's say, works in the style of the chanson, the rondo, other secular poetic forms of that era? Yes. Is that music going to be preserved? Not always. Not always, right? Because who's going to be trained to write down music and preserve it in an archive somewhere? Well, most people in that era didn't know how to write their names. So it's going to be the monks or the church scribes who would have had the acumen to transcribe this music and then put it on a scroll somewhere where it would have been kept and then transcribed here in modern notation. All right, without further ado, let's listen to just a little bit. And we'll listen to a little bit with score so you can see how truly unusual this music is when we listen to it. There are all sorts of peculiarities in the actual notation. For those of you who are watching, you'll see strange rhythms. For those of you who maybe are a little bit more sensitive with your ears, you will hear bizarre cross relationships. What that means is you might have notes that conflict and sound starkly dissonant. And a later generation, even in the Renaissance, they would have said, what the heck is that? C sharp against C natural at the same time? What a jazz musician would call a split third or a sharp 9 chord? No, not in a later era. But in the Middle Ages, it's the Wild West, and apparently it was inoffensive to them. So let's go ahead and listen to a little bit of the Kyrie. You can hear that cadence on eleison. They pronounce it here a little bit different. They're using French Latin here, which has some differences. So you might find in the Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi versus qui tollis peccata mundi. Different areas in Europe had different pronunciations of certain Latin words. What's truly bizarre here is what we would later call a suspension here, this ya-da-dum. Now, a later composer might have harmonized it like this. If you want to have this in your melody, they're in a different key, but let's say you want to have, you might harmonize like this at a cadence. Here, we get a G sharp on the bottom, E, then a C sharp, and they would do things like this, which is totally fine. The problem is instead of starting here, right, with the E, G sharp, C sharp, instead of doing it at the same time, they have the top voice suspended. So you get this, right? Again, later on, composers will be very circumspect about using these kind of dissonances. Machaut probably didn't think too much about it. Let's listen again just to that cadence. Almost sounds like someone sang a wrong note. They didn't. That's what's in the score. Let's go on to the Messe de Notre Dame, and this is the Agnus Dei, the fifth and final movement. Recall the text. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem. Lamb of God, who taketh away the sins of the world, grant unto us peace. This is the movement that I showed you the score of earlier with that incredible syncopation. We have to be very careful. I call it syncopation. You might call it syncopation. Remember what syncopation is. If I'm counting 1, 2, 3, and I have this kind of rhythm, a lot of the notes that I play with my right hand there fit in the cracks between the beats. That's what syncopation is. In jazz, syncopation is everywhere, and it's one of the most enchanting attributes in the rhythm of jazz. It's built into the rhythm of jazz. Syncopation, jazz musicians very rarely consistently play on the beat. Often they play on the beat, between the beats. But for choral music, that's a little bit more unusual. As we'll see in the second half of the program when we get to the Renaissance, this syncopation is abandoned. I mentioned it because we call it syncopation. That's not a word that would have made sense to Machaut. The beat is not a concept that would have made sense to him. The Renaissance and the medieval musicians, for that matter, did not have traditional measure lines in the music. They didn't say, oh, this is measure 3 and this is measure 4, and I'm going to leap up a perfect fourth there, and I'm going to go to a B flat there. All of this is anachronistic, all of it. Which is one of the reasons it's so hard to discuss medieval music. And I think for students in the musical history survey classes, it's a challenge for them because talking about music in general is very difficult. And now if you tell someone you have to develop a totally different vocabulary, all of the parlance you developed, throw it out the window. I mean, ask a typical college student to describe music, even music they love. What do you love about it? Oh, it sounds good. Why does it sound good? It sounds nice. What about it sounds nice? Well, yes, it's difficult. And if you tell a student you can't say it, you can't talk about it in terms of harmony or rhythm or measures, it's one of the challenges here. But there is great beauty in this music. Let's listen to a couple of phrases from the Agnus. You hear when they cadence there, it's not a chord, it's not a triad, it's just 2 notes, F and C, as it's printed in this modern transcription. They really avoided triads. They avoided traditional harmony that we would think of as traditional harmony. Let's keep listening. Not easy to sing this music. It's really not. The ear resists some of the patterns which are unusual. They would outline tritones, for example, something like this. Right, outlining things like that. The composers would avoid lines like that, but it's all over the place here. Now you'll note there are 4 singers, more or less corresponding to the SATB configuration we discussed. But notice that these period authentic ensembles do not use women typically. And the reason is that the mentality is, if you want to preserve period authenticity, make it truly correct to the era that it comes from, you'd have to perform it the way that Machaut, for example, would have had it performed at the cathedral in Reims, which is to say, with men singing. And what it means is that these pieces can be difficult to do in period authentic fashion if you're not using women to sing the high parts. Because if you were trying to do this, if I tried to do this with my, we have a barbershop octet on campus, getting singers to sing like this with no vibrato, straight tone all the way, and getting, guys who can sing parts that more or less correspond to alto and soprano, it's tricky. It's tricky. So these singers, we can really appreciate what they're doing because it is so difficult to pull this off. And as much as I would love to stay in the Middle Ages, which is a really enchanting era, we're going to move on to the Renaissance. As we do that, I want to just include a footnote to this term, Middle Ages. Why is it called the Middle Ages? And the answer is because there was a rather derisive, scathing opinion of this period in later generations. Take, for example, the poet Petrarch. Petrarch is generally credited with coining this term, Middle Ages. The term was derived because Petrarch said, hey, look at this, folks. The period of what we now call antiquity, that is to say, the Greeks and the Romans especially, Petrarch would have known quite a bit about that culture. Look at what they built. Aqueducts and paved roads and beautiful homes and palaces and marble and granite and swimming pools and bathhouses and the Colosseum and the Pantheon and so many other buildings, which they would have been able to visit the ruins, right? Someone like Petrarch would have seen it. They really had it right. That was Petrarch's attitude, that the Romans had presided over this period of prosperity and profound learning and understanding. And then there was this period of about 1,000 years from the fall of Rome in the mid-5th century up until, let's say, Petrarch's own time, which is the late 14th century into the 15th century, where people were so backward. Look at how regressive they were. They slept on the floor in hovels. They had dirt floors. They had terrible nutrition. They were illiterate. They were constantly at war, these soldiers for this vassal fighting for this duke or this king against the other king, people dying of disease. People, generally speaking, were, from Petrarch's perspective at least, profoundly ignorant on balance. And then Petrarch looked around and said, look at what's happening in Italy now in the 14th century, what we would later call the Renaissance. We are embracing learning. We are living a life that is so different from these people who lived this backward, regressive life in their hovels for 1,000 years. It's also where we get the term the Dark Ages, right? That term is mostly rejected in academic circles now. Most historians would reject that term. And what I always say is this, Petrarch, it's understandable that he would have taken a kind of a haughty perspective on the generations that preceded him. But the fact is that beautiful art was created during the Middle Ages, and we just sampled some of it. And that's to say nothing of the more salient examples in Europe. For example, the cathedrals. Anybody who's ever read Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth, I imagine some of you have read that book. It's about the building of a cathedral in the 12th century in England. And you realize what it meant to build a building that maybe had a spire that reached up 400 feet into the sky. Back in an era, there's no caterpillars, there's no bulldozers, everything is done by hand. It's remarkable. So as we say goodbye to the Middle Ages tonight, we can appreciate Machaut's art and also appreciate all the other wonderful art that was created in this period, whether it's the visual arts or the cathedrals and certainly the music. We only alluded to the works of Hildegard or I mentioned in passing Léonin, Periton. I did not mention Benchois, Dufay, Ockeghem,
Philippe de Vitry. So there's a lot of great music in this period. And if you're ever looking to broaden your horizons and your perspective on medieval music, I'd be happy to give you some recommendations. All right, on to the Renaissance. What are some of the big changes that take place in the Renaissance? I would say that we could look to a statue that was carved in the early 16th century by Michelangelo. It's in Florence. It's about 17 feet high, and it shows a naked man in the prime physical condition of youth. And of course, I'm talking about Michelangelo's David. To appreciate the disparity between medieval art and Renaissance art, when we talk about medieval art, perhaps the most famous artist of that period is Giotto. Compare Giotto to Michelangelo, and what do you notice? Well, there's no naked people in Giotto's art of the 14th century, 13th and 14th centuries. What does it tell us? It tells us that in the Renaissance, there is this new phenomenon which is blooming, and it's called humanism. Now, you might say, well, Gil, isn't humanism traditionally intertwined with secularism? That is to say, if you have a movement, humanism, which embraces the beauty of the human body and human creativity and what it means to be human, art created by humans, you get things like a naked statue of biblical David, the king of Israel, about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. And if you look at that statue, Michelangelo's attention to detail is amazing. You can see, for example, the pectoral muscles, the abdominal muscles, all the muscles. There's a cephalic vein in the bicep, which indicates that David is below 10% body fat. Now, that's the only way you get that vein to pop, by the way. Things we learn here at the Wilton Library, Michael. All sorts of things. David has a nice low hairline. It's practically brushing his eyebrows. So it's David in his youth. And of course, he's naked. So yes, that does evince the qualities of secularism. To depict somebody in their natural state, a human being naked, is something that really could have only happened in the 16th century and beyond. If you look at medieval music, medieval art, I should say, the characters are often wearing cloaks. They're two-dimensional. There's no foreground or background. And you don't see any glorification of the human body. In fact, in medieval music, we sometimes joke that the most popular composer of the Middle Ages, you know who it was? Anonymous. Because about 60% of the folios that survive from that period have no attribution. The medieval perspective was, it's not about me. I am a vessel. I am a conduit. I am merely conveying the glory of God. J.S. Bach would echo this sentiment in his manuscripts hundreds of years later, where he would write the Latin phrase, Soli Deo Gloria, for the glory of God alone. More on that in our next program. In the Renaissance, we start to see more familiar musical elements coalescing. Chords, triads, chord progressions. Josquin would not have called it, oh, that's my 4 chord, that's my 2/7 chord, the way a jazz musician would describe it, the way Dave Brubeck would have probably called out changes to his musicians very early in his days when he was jamming in Northern California. But instead, we can talk about it in those terms, but what we have to say is we have to qualify it and say, this sounds like a D minor chord. This sounds like an F major 7 chord. Josquin would not have understood those terms and used those terms, certainly. Josquin hailed from a region of Europe that corresponds now to northern France, Belgium. Then he was called Franco-Flemish. And it must be said that many of the great composers of the Renaissance, especially the early Renaissance, people like Josquin, people like Heinrich Isaac, these were composers of the Franco-Flemish school. In music history, we have schools. They are not physical schools, obviously. These are schools that describe general stylistic traits that composers of a particular time or region have in common. Let me give you some examples of your favorite music schools. Some of you will be big fans of the North German school of the Baroque period. This would include composers like Bach, but also going back to Dietrich Buxtehude. If you don't know Buxtehude, you don't know what you're missing. Buxtehude? Who? Buxtehude. Buxtehude is awesome. There's a story about Bach more or less walking a couple of 100 miles to hear Buxtehude play. Almost certainly apocryphal, but it makes for a great story, doesn't it? So that's the North German school. At the end of the 18th century, we get the Viennese school. Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert has at least one foot in the Viennese school. People love the Viennese school. Think about it. How many concerts you go to that have music from the Viennese school composers. The second Viennese school, well, I don't know how many people would count that their favorite. That would include Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Webern, Alban Berg. The good stuff, folks. The good 12-tone music. Everyone's favorite. Maybe we'll have a special program here, Michael, and I'll talk about the glory of Alban Berg and Arnold Schoenberg. I love Arnold Schoenberg. I have to admit, I find that music, it's not the most charming music on the surface, perhaps. But, I could tell you a short story, a very quick anecdote, if I might. I remember when I was in my early 20s and I was discovering Schoenberg, and I always tell my students we had those things back then that these funny little things, they were like shaped like a circle and had a little hole in the middle. We called them CDs. And I had a CD changer in my car. And I remember I was going on a date. A friend had set me up with a lovely young girl, and I went, picked her up. And she said, well, what are you listening to? What do you have in your CD player? And I said, no, don't touch that. And of course, she pressed play, and Pierrot Lunaire came on, 1912, wonderful piece. And, if you know Pierrot Lunaire, it starts, Steig unter alle Schmerzen auf den Arthur meine Verse. There was no second date. What are you going to do? She gave me a look that suggested she thought I was going to kill her and put her in a freezer. I said, no, let me tell you about this awesome thing. It's called German Expressionism. It's wonderful. Anyway, all right. So we have these schools in music history, and the Franco-Flemish school in the Renaissance, very famous. Josquin was known for taking a kind of mathematical precision to composition. So form is coalescing. The rules are starting to coalesce. And we're going to have composers in this century that Josquin dies in the 16th century writing what are essentially the first music theory textbooks. Giuseppe Zarlino comes to mind. He's credited, he's a kind of a footnote in music history, but he wrote what is considered one of the first music history treatises, music theory treatises, I should say, in music history. Josquin worked with pre-existing melodies, some of which came from the medieval period. And he wrote mass settings on these tunes. Some of these mass settings are named after tunes that were secular in nature. One of the most famous is the L'Homme Armé. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the L'Homme Armé. It comes from an old tune. L'homme armé, ram pa pam, pa 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 ram pi ram pam, pa da dee ram pa ram pam, pa da dee ram pam pa dee, pam pa da dee pam pam. And then it repeats the A section. What Josquin would do is he would take this tune. The L'Homme Armé means the armed man, and the poem was basically Beware the Armed Man. And he would take this secular tune and he'd build a mass around the tune. So there is the Missa L'Homme Armé super voces musicales, where every successive movement goes up a tone in terms of its starting pitch, and it's always based on the L'Homme Armé melody. What that means for us listeners is we have to be sleuths. If we're trying to connect the dots and trying to find where does that melody come from, then what we would do is we would say, let's go back and find the original tune. Some of these tunes came from Gregorian chant, as we'll see in just a moment, old hymns, liturgical melodies, and they were reworked as sort of source material for a mass setting. Now, lest you think that somehow this dilutes the authenticity of the work, let me assure you it does not. It's a time-honored tradition to take an existing melody and build around it. What you often see the composer do is stretch the original melody into very long tones. We're going to go ahead and take a look at Josquin's Missa Pangelingua. This melody, the Pangelingua, is an important one for us because we're starting with it today and we will revisit it on June 25th in our capstone program when we talk about Dave Brubeck. The tune is traditionally associated to St. Thomas Aquinas, although the actual poem may have come from the 6th century, the time of Gregory the Great. But if indeed Aquinas wrote the melody, which might be true, but is not likely. In music history, it is not uncommon for pieces to be attributed to composers who had nothing to do with it. The best example is Gregorian chant. We call it Gregorian chant after Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great. Pope Gregory had nothing to do with the development of Gregorian chant. I can assure you of that. Later on, you would have composers, again, taking credit for works. For example, Greensleeves, which is a traditional English Renaissance melody. John Coltrane recorded a famous, a modal jazz exploration of Greensleeves. It's great. And it's sometimes attributed to Henry VIII. Well, Henry VIII did kind of write music, but he didn't write Greensleeves, folks. So he didn't write Scarborough Fair either. At any rate. When we talk about attribution, we have to take it with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, this is based on a melody that comes all the way from Thomas Aquinas. Keep it in mind. We're going to revisit it in our fifth and final program here, because none other than Wilton's own Dave Brubeck wrote, on a commission from a church in Sacramento, a set of variations on the Pangalingua melody. Pangalingua comes from the Latin meaning, make my voice sing. Let's sing my voice, I guess is how you might translate it literally. Here's Josquin. Now notice we have, again, bass, tenor, a kind of low alto part, and a soprano part. We are transcribing, whoever transcribed this puts it in 3/1 time. Not a lot of music's in 3/1 time. In the modern era, that's a time signature I'm trying to think if I've ever seen it. I think the opening to Carmina Burana is in 3/1 time. Pretty sure it is. Boom. Oh, 4, 2. I think it is written in 3/1. At any rate, we can just appreciate what Josquin is doing here. Imitation is almost always part of the game. So what that means is you start with a voice, you echo the same motif, but in a lower voice. And they didn't have measure lines back then. The editor has put them in to make it easier for a modern viewer to appreciate. Let's listen. Notice we're starting with what's called an incipit, which is a chant, and that's going to go on for a little bit. So let me go to the end of that. We praise thee, we bless thee, we adore thee. Lord, King of heaven, God the Father, omnipotent. Jesus, the only Son. What do you think of Josquin? Very different than what we listened to start. All of the dissonances and the really again, anachronistic, but the extensively syncopated rhythms, more or less absent here. You can see here, just looking at this page, even if you don't read music, there's a kind of regularity to the way the notes are laid out. They're laid out either in notes that correspond to a single beat, that would be the whole note, or the half notes, which get a half beat each. So that's just a little bit of Josquin's Missa Pangelingua, and that is a text and a melody we'll want to revisit, and I'm going to bring this piece up in our last program. Everyone's going to get a quiz. Just kidding. No quizzes, folks. No quizzes. All right. We're going to finish with the Dresdner Kammerchor. This is a piece that comes probably written about 30 years after Josquin's death. And it was written by a composer by the name of Giovanni Luigi Palestrina. To understand Palestrina's contributions to music history, we have to consider what had transpired in the decades around the time of Josquin's death in 1521 until here, let's say sometime in the 1550s. And of course, I'm referring to the Reformation. The Reformation was, for the Catholic Church as an institution, a catastrophic event. Not only did they lose power in large swaths of Europe, but all of a sudden, they found themselves scrambling to consolidate power in areas. And when I say power here, I mean authority. I don't mean that in the corporate sense. I mean it in the sense that, people, even those who rejected Lutheranism, who rejected the teachings of Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland or John Calvin, well, there was still a lot of sense of uncertainty in areas that were maybe not in deep Catholic territory, for example, Italy, but maybe parts of Germany. Most of Germany would embrace Lutheranism, but there were parts like Bavaria that remained Catholic. So the Catholic Church convenes this council from 1545 to 63. Someone mentioned it earlier, the Council of Trent. And one of the things that they discussed, we could talk ad infinitum about the Council of Trent and what they discussed. But essentially, when it comes to music, they, in this counter-reformational mindset, we're thinking, what can we do to bring in the wayward flock, to remind people of what it means to attain salvation, to be blessed with the gift of grace through the church. Yes, we're not going to address, everything Luther said. And Luther maybe perhaps, brought up points that would have been uncomfortable. The sexual excesses of Pope Alexander VI. Alexander Sextus, real name Rodrigo Borgia. Alexander Sextus put the sex in Sextus. He had a secret tunnel created so he could bring mistresses through to the apostolic palace. He had children. Popes are not supposed to have children. There's rumors that have been swirling since the early 16th century that his children, Cesare Borgia and Lucrezia Borgia, had an incestuous relationship. So there was scandal there. Luther also, he pointed to the selling of indulgences. That's very famous. Most people don't really understand what that meant. That meant that if you were living in a bucolic town or village in Europe and a priest came through once every couple of months and said, okay, I'm going to take your confession. And you said, well, Father, you see, last night I drank to excess and then I leered at my neighbor's wife and I feel terrible about it. Well, the priest might say, listen, see the scroll here? And the scroll, the indulgence, was essentially, it was supposed to be merit. There was this idea in the early church teachings that Jesus and the apostles, they were so virtuous, they were so meritorious, that when they went to heaven, they brought with them the excess merit that they had because they weren't prone to sinfulness and the like. Not at least as much as a normal person would be. And so therefore, there was this abstract concept in heaven called the treasure house of merit. And these scrolls contained a little bit of that merit so that when you went before the judge on the day of judgment, right? What's the line in the Requiem? Quando judex venturus, when the judge comes, cunda stricte, to judge very strictly, then, well, your malfeasance is going to be put on the scale next to your merit. And boy, wouldn't it be nice to have a little bit extra merit on that day? And that's what the indulgence was. At any rate, we don't have time to discuss all the doctrinal differences between Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, all of whom were on the Reformation side in the Catholic Church. But suffice to say that at the Council of Trent, the ecclesiastical authorities within the church were wondering, what can we do to reestablish the authority that the Catholic Church has lost? And they looked at music and they thought, what about this? Music has become so complex. It's become really sort of wordy, and especially in some works by Josquin, motets, and other mass settings, this singer is singing this word and that singer is singing this word, and there's rhythms that are crossing, and it's all very complex. What if we simplify things? Let's go back to the glory days. Well, what were the glory days where the church was unchallenged in its authority? The medieval period. What kind of music was predominant then? Gregorian chant. And they actually considered in the 1540s reverting church services to Gregorian chant. The story goes that along came Palestrina and he wrote a mass that was a dedication to a new pope, Pope Marcellus. And this is the Missa Papae Marcelli. And that in doing so, he convinced the church authorities that music could be polyphonic and dense and written for multiple independent voices, but still coherent and clear. That's probably apocryphal. The truth is we don't really know, but there's scant evidence. There's no smoking gun. Sometimes you'll read in older textbooks that it will say that Palestrina was the savior of church music, because through the Missa Papae Marcelli, he demonstrated that mass settings could be coherent even if you're writing for multiple voices. Palestrina goes beyond 4 voices. This is for 6 voices. I believe there's 2 sopranos and 2 tenor parts in the Missa Papae Marcelli. This is a wonderful group, the Dresdner Kammerchor, the Dresden Chamber Choir, and this is the Missa Papae Marcelli, written for Pope Marcellus towards the middle of the 16th century. This is thought of as a counter-reformational mass setting. We're entering the period here where, depending on where you are in Europe, settings of the Catholic Mass ordinary, the full Missa Tota liturgy, are going to be rarer. You're not going to find them, for example, in the works of Michael Pretorius, a contemporary of Palestrina's, who was German and therefore Lutheran. Not exactly a contemporary, maybe a generation later. Let's listen to the Missa Papae Marcelli, and we will listen to the entirety of the Kyrie, which is, again, derived from a Greek text, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. The Lord have mercy part comes from the Hebrew, Chaneni Adonai, which can be found in, I think, 5 or 6 different psalms. You can hear how clear the voices are here. Not bad. Not bad. Whether or not Palestrina really did compel the church authorities to abandon their plan to reinstate Gregorian chant as the only form of music making in church is dubious at best. But one thing cannot be denied. This is music of tremendous expressive quality. And I would suggest that if you're a singer, even a casual singer who likes a challenge, and you happen to know 5 other singers, get together with them and have them sing through this music. And the reason I mention this with Palestrina in particular is because what you'll find is that Palestrina's music is sort of engineered on a structural level for fluid music making. In other words, the lines are crystalline in nature. They're very clear. The ability to sing through this counterpoint with some facility, some ease, might surprise those of you who are singers. Even if you're not a comfortable sight singer, there is something about the nature of Palestrina's music that makes it accessible both to the singer and, of course, as we've seen, to the listener. And for this reason, he developed this reputation as the savior of church music, because the music was considered to be totally accessible. We don't need to worry about everything that the Council of Trent was complaining about, namely that church music had become too esoteric, too complex, too polyphonic, too busy, to use an anachronistic term. We've had a lot of those tonight. Palestrina shows that it can be very rich, very deeply textured, but also totally clear. And if you're looking for some music to either appreciate as a singer or just as a listener, you can't go wrong with Giovanni Luigi da Palestrina. On that note, my friends, we will hop in our time machine for our next program, and we will go to the 1740s and take a look at Johann Sebastian Bach's very unlikely setting of the Mass Ordinary text. And that, of course, can be found in one of his most celebrated vocal works. Bach wrote a lot of great choral music, over 200 cantatas, the Passion oratorios, and in fact, there are 5 kleine Messe, the 5 small masses or shorter masses. But the granddaddy of them all, the B minor Mass, which we will tackle in our next program. Before we end tonight's program, I want to open it up for questions, and hopefully I'll have a good answer. Yes, a question. I think they're coming down with a microphone. Thank you, Kevin. Excellent question. Do we have any idea what Roman music sounded like? This is a great point, because the term Renaissance means rebirth, right? We learned that in social studies in our middle school classes, probably. And that might be true of literature, where you could read Homer, you could read Virgil, and you could kind of understand for example, the meter they employ in their poetry and the style of writing. It could be true in architecture, where you could get yourself over to the Colosseum and see, well, how did they build it? It could not be true in music. Certainly not in the Renaissance period. Nobody then had any clue what Roman music sounded like. Even today, the most erudite scholar who has a PhD and several postdocs and has written books knows less about Roman music than a third-year graduate student would know about Mozart, for example. There's just not a lot of material that survives. What we would know that would probably be the most shocking thing about it is that their tuning systems seem to have been different. And so you'll encounter microtones in that music. And this makes it very disorientating to listen to. Good question. We're all medievaled out, Michael.
Okay, well, thanks, Gil. That was really a nice
Thank you,
deep
folks.
dive. Thank you.
Thank you.
And hope to see you all at the next 4. It's going to be really, really great. I can just tell. Hope you can too. One other program I want to mention to you might find interesting. On Monday, March 31 in the evening, Darius Brubeck and his wife Kathy will be here to talk about their recently published memoir, which is about their activities in mostly, I would say, jazz education and largely in South Africa, but in other international settings where Darius and Kathy had a big role in that. And along with talking about the book, reading a little bit from it, and of course there'll be books for sale and for them to sign. We're also going to screen a short documentary that was made that's related to the memoir. So that's on Monday, March 31.
Very cool.
Otherwise, we'll see you there. We'll see you at the concerts that are coming. We'll see you at Gil's future programs. We'll see you at everything we do here.
Have a good night, folks. Get home safe. And remember how impressive it's going to be when you're at your next family gathering or you're with your friends and neighbors and you can tell them all about medieval music. It's going to be great. Have a good night.